If you've been in leadership for any length of time, you've likely had this moment where something becomes so clear you can never unsee it. It doesn't come from a meeting or a specific decision, and most of the time, nothing around you looks different. But internally, something shifts. You look around and ask yourself, is this still what I want, or just what I've built? You start to sense a tension between what you built and something you can't quite name yet. And once you see it, well, you can't unsee it. You can try to forget what you realized. You can keep moving like nothing happened. But you really can't go back. And over time, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I keep this going? It becomes, what do I do now that I know? That shift is where leadership becomes more honest. Because awareness doesn't ask anything from you, but responsibility does. And we can learn a little something about this from the world of whiskey. When a distiller is making whiskey, they pay close attention to what comes through the still. They make adjustments based on what they're noticing, and then they run it through the still again. The distiller notices everything during the process. They're not just watching for output, they're paying special attention to what's actually coming through. What carries the character after they're after? What needs to be refined? What will shape the final result over time? To make a great whiskey, not everything carries forward. Some things get removed. Some things get refined, and some things are shaped over time. And what doesn't make the cut is intentionally left behind to protect what the spirit is meant to become. This is the distillation process. And while it sounds linear, it really isn't. It runs, pauses, adjusts, and then it runs again. Each run is shaped by what was revealed in the last run. And that's how great leadership works too. Because after the first run, you don't stop. Now that you know, you run it again. If that sounds a bit familiar, you're not alone. It's a conversation I've been having more and more with leaders in different roles, different industries, and different stages. While the details vary, the tension is surprisingly consistent. That moment when something has been noticed and the question shifts. If you've been listening for a while, you know that much of what we explored in the last season was centered around awareness. Seeing things more clearly, asking better questions, noticing where there might be a gap between how we're leading and who we actually are. And for a lot of leaders, that shift alone changes how everything is seen. But awareness has a tendency to lead somewhere, because once you see it, there's no going back to not seeing it. Season 1 was about building that awareness. Season 2 is about what comes next. Now that you know, what do you do with it? That is what the season's about. Not urgency or reinvention, but participation. A more intentional engagement with what's been revealed. And before we go any further, it's worth saying that these episodes aren't meant to be followed in a straight line. And they're not chapters from a book. Each one is like a different pour, a different theme, a new tension, something worth noticing, a resource, something to come back to depending on the season that you're in or the tension that you're navigating. So if this is your first time here, or if you missed a few conversations along the way, you can always go back. Not to catch up, but to revisit what might be relevant now. Because the same idea can land very differently depending on when you hear it. For me, this shift from noticing to engaging became personal in a new way recently through a moment that literally stopped me. Before I get there, I want to spend a few minutes to take you inside the distillery. Because what happens there is the clearest picture I know of what this season is actually about. When most people think about making whiskey, they picture a straight production line. Raw ingredients go in, the spirit comes out. It ages in a barrel, and everything eventually becomes something worth drinking. But that's not really how it works. Step inside a working distillery and you feel it immediately. The smell hits you first. Sweet, warm, almost thick in the air. That's the mash. Grain and water fermenting before it ever sees heat, before it ever becomes anything. It smells like potential. And then you move further in and the temperature rises. The still comes into view. If it's a pot still, it's copper, round-bottomed, and taller than you would expect. It's radiating a steady, even heat. And you can even hear it working. It's a low, rhythmic sound. The first drops of the spirit begin to fall slowly and deliberately into the collection vessel below. Nothing is rushed here. Everything is observed. A pot still, this kind specifically, isn't built for speed or efficiency. It's built to preserve character. The oils and the esters, the things that give the spirit its depth, the pot still holds on to them. On purpose. The distiller doesn't just run it and walk away. They run it, they pause. They evaluate what came through, what formed, what surprised them, and what doesn't belong. And once they know what this run produced, they decide what goes into the next one. Run, pause, no, run again. That's the process. That's how something raw becomes something worth keeping. The distiller is responsible for that. Not just running the still, but stewarding it. Paying attention to what's coming through. To the environment and to the outcome they're moving toward. And that last part really matters. Because the distiller doesn't run it again blindly. They run it again with what they now know. Leadership works like this too. We tend to think being a leader as continuous forward motion. Build, grow, keep going, protect at all costs. But true leadership isn't just forward motion. It's refinement along the way, knowing when to engage the work and when to pause. It's in the pause that the most important questions surface. The season we're in, the tension we've been carrying, what belongs and what doesn't. Like the spirit in the still, not everything carries forward in the same way. Some things are refined. Some things are released. Some things are reshaped over time. Rerunning isn't starting over. It's about active participation. A willingness to stay present in the process and to run it again with a clearer sense of what matters. So not too long ago, this idea of the pause became real in one simple moment. I was scrolling one day, just moving through content like we all do, and I stopped on a post. It was one of those short videos with words over a calming scenery, music playing in the background. A British AI voice layered over it. He said, "Instead of waking up every morning thinking today is one more day, wake up thinking today is one less day. One less day." Bam! It changed everything for me. Those three words reframe something I think we all understand, but we don't always let fully resonate. Time isn't something we manage later. It's something that we're already spending right now. And when I went back to sit with that again, it didn't motivate me to get more done. It didn't make me think about walking away from everything I built. But it did clarify something. It made me start looking at what I was giving my time to and asking a different question. Is what I'm spending my time on aligned with what truly matters? Because if time is becoming less abundant and more defined, then how we spend it matters more. What gets kept? What gets refined? What gets our full attention and what doesn't? For me, that 30-second clip became a lens. Not a rule, not something to force, but something that sharpened how I think about the process, about how I show up, how I lead, how I decide what moves forward and what doesn't. And when I think back to that distiller, the goal was never to do more or become more efficient. It's always been about refinement toward something significant. One less day was my pause, my moment between runs. And once I saw it, I couldn't go back to not knowing. And here's what I've been noticing. I'm not the only one sitting with this. In conversations over the last several months, messages, responses to episodes, short moments after a meeting or a presentation, leaders have been saying something like this. Not always in those exact words, but the pattern is consistent enough that I can't ignore it. Someone will describe a season that they're moving out of. And it's usually a good season for the business-wise. But then they'll pause and say something like, I'm not sure I'm doing what I'm actually supposed to be doing. Or I keep waiting for the feeling that this is enough and it's not coming. Or sometimes just, I think I'm being called for something different. That's not a performance problem. That's not a strategy problem. That's a distillation problem. Something hasn't been refined yet. Something is still in the still being separated, still being shaped. And that pause, well, that's what makes it visible. What I've also noticed is the leaders who are furthest along in that clarity aren't the ones who figured it all out. They're the ones who stopped treating the tension as a problem to solve and started treating it as information. Just like the still doing its work, revealing what belongs and what doesn't. Some of those conversations revealed things like, I don't know if I can slow this down right now. Or I've worked too hard to get here to disrupt it. I get that. Because when something is working, when people are depending on it, a pause can be risky. But the distiller doesn't see the pause that way. The pause isn't a threat to the process. It's part of what protects it. And it's where they make sure what's moving forward still reflects what they're trying to create. They trust that stepping back into the process, running it again, is how the work actually becomes what it's meant to be. And if any of that sounds familiar, it's worth pausing and sitting with. That's what Season 2 is going to keep exploring. Not as a framework or a system, but more like what happens in a good tasting room, where an honest conversation surfaces something that wouldn't have come up anywhere else. What it looks like to steward what's been entrusted to us with intention. How identity shapes decisions in real time. The specific tensions that surface when awareness starts becoming action. Same room, deeper conversation. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you know you take notes of what you tasted so you can remember and refer back to it. Here are my tasting notes from today. Yours might be different. The pause isn't a break from the process. It is the process. The distiller doesn't pause because something went wrong. They pause because that's when the most important evaluation happens. What came through? What didn't? What the next run needs. A leader who never pauses isn't moving faster. They're just carrying more than they should for longer than they need to. One less day doesn't create urgency to do more. It creates alignment. The reframe isn't a countdown. It's a clarifying question. Is what I'm giving my time to actually aligned with what matters? Not more pressure to perform, more intention about what gets the next run. The tension isn't the problem. The tension is the information. What feels like resistance or restlessness is often the still doing its work, separating what belongs from what doesn't. The leaders who move through it aren't the ones who resolve it the fastest. They're the ones who stopped treating it as something to fix and started listening to what it was revealing. Now that you know, you're responsible for what comes next. Awareness is a gift, but it changes the equation. Before you saw the tension, you can move past it without consequence. But once you see it, that option closes. Not because someone is watching, but because you are. If you want to go deeper with any of these ideas, I put a full set of tasting notes for this episode with additional reflections and space to work through them. You can find those at craftedclarity.net. So as you step back into your day, into your leadership, into everything that you're carrying, one less day has a way of staying with you. Not as pressure, but as perspective. What you give your attention to, what you choose to refine, and what you choose to release. Because over time, those decisions shape more than the outcome. They shape whether what you're building stays aligned with what you're here to steward. The distiller knows this. After every run, after the heat and the patience and the evaluation, they don't stop. They take what they now know and they run it again. Now that you know, what will you do with it? Thanks for joining me in the tasting room. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.